The inheritance of God's Son. Never forget that the sonship is your salvation, for the sonship is yourself. As God's creation, it is yours, and belonging to you, it is His. Yourself does not need salvation, but your mind needs to learn what salvation is. You are not saved from anything, but you are saved for glory. Glory is your inheritance given you by your Creator that you might extend it. Yet if you hate part of yourself, all your understanding is lost, because you are looking on what God created as yourself without love. And since what He created is part of Him, you are denying Him His place in His own altar. Could you try to make God homeless and know that you are at home? Can the Son deny the Father without believing that the Father has denied Him? I'd laugh. It's like Jesus brings up not healing on the Sabbath, and it's like, are you gonna kick somebody out? But then again, it's like, God gave you the house, and are you gonna kick Him out? Or can you live with yourself knowing that He's out there and you kicked Him out? God's laws hold only for your protection, and they never hold in vain. What you experience when you deny your Father is still for your protection. For the power of your will cannot be lessened without the intervention of God against it, and any limitation on your power is not the will of God. Therefore, look only to the power that God gave us to save you, remembering that it is yours because it is His, and join with your brothers in His peace. Your peace lies in its limitlessness. Limit the peace you share, and yourself must be unknown to you. Every altar to God is part of you because the light He created is one with Him. Would you cut off a brother from light that is yours? You would not do so if you realize that you can darken only your own mind. As you bring him back, so will you return. That is the law of God for the protection of the wholeness of His Son. Only you can deprive yourself of anything. Do not oppose this realization, for it is truly the beginning of the dawn of light. Remember also that the denial of this simple fact takes only forms, and these you must learn to recognize and to oppose steadfastly, without exception. This is a crucial step in the reawakening. The beginning phases of this reversal are often quite painful, for as blame is withdrawn from without, there is strong tendency to harbor it within. It is difficult at first to realize that this is exactly the same thing, for there is no distinction between within and without. You gotta get rid of it. If your brothers are part of you, you blame them for your deprivation. You are blaming yourself, and you cannot blame yourself without blaming them. That is why blame must be undone, not seen elsewhere. Lay it to yourself, and you cannot know yourself, for only the ego blames at all. Self-blame is therefore ego identification, and as much as ego's defense as blaming others. You cannot enter God's presence if you attack His Son. When His Son lifts His voice in praise of His Creator, He will hear the voice of His Father. Yet the Creator cannot be praised without His Son, for their glory is shared, and they are glorified together. Christ is at God's altar, waiting to welcome His Son. But come wholly without condemnation, for otherwise you will believe that the door is barred and you cannot enter. The door is not barred, and it is impossible that you cannot enter the place where God would have you be. But love yourself with the love of Christ, for so does your Father love you. You can refuse to enter, but you cannot bar the door that Christ holds open. Come unto me, who holds it open for you, for while I live, it cannot be shut, and I live forever. God is my life and yours, and nothing is denied by the God to his Son, by God to his Son. At God's altar, Christ waits for the restoration of himself in you. God knows his Son as wholly blameless as himself, and he is approached through the appreciation of his Son. Christ waits for you. Missed a page. Christ waits for your acceptance of him as yourself, and of his wholeness as yours. For Christ is the Son of God who lives in his Creator and shines with his glory. Christ is the extension of love and the loveliness of God, as perfect as his Creator and at peace with him. Blessed is the Son of God, whose radiance is of his Father, and whose glory he wills to share as his Father shares it with him. There is no condemnation in the Son, for there is no condemnation in the Father. Sharing the perfect love of the Father, the Son must share what belongs to him, for otherwise he will not know the Father or the Son. Peace be unto you who rest in God, and in whom the whole sonship rests. The dynamics of the ego. I believe it's in parentheses because the ego isn't real, so you're personifying something that doesn't exist. No one can escape from illusions unless he looks at them, for not looking is the way they are protected. There is no need to shrink from illusions, for they cannot be dangerous. We are ready to look more closely at the ego's thought system because together we have the lamp that will dispel it. And since you realize you do not want it, you must be ready. The dynamics of the ego will be our lesson for a while, for we must look at this to see beyond it. Since you have made it real, we will undo this error together and then look beyond it to truth. What is healing but the removal of all that stands in the way of knowledge? And how else can one dispel illusions except by looking at them directly? Without protecting them, right? Because you're trying to overlook them, because you don't want to, Be not afraid. Therefore, for you will be looking at is the source of fear, and you are beginning to learn that fear is not real. It's fake. I made it up. You are also learning that its effects can be dispelled merely by denying their reality. Most of the time. The next step is obviously to recognize that what has no effects does not exist. Laws do not operate in a vacuum. They need circumstances. And what leads to nothing has not happened. If reality is recognized by its extension, what leads to nothing could not be real. Do not be afraid, then, to look upon fear, for it can be seen. Clarity undoes confusion by definition, and to look upon darkness through light must dispel it. Let us begin this lesson in ego dynamics by understanding that the term itself does not mean anything. It contains the very contradiction in terms that makes it meaningless. Dynamics implies the power to do something, and the whole separation fallacy lies in the belief that the ego has the power to do anything. The ego is fearful to you because you believe this, yet the truth is very simple. All power is of God. What is not of him has no power to do anything. When we look at the ego, then, we are not considering dynamics, but delusions. You can surely regard a delusional system without fear, for it cannot have any effects if its source is not real. Fear becomes more obviously inappropriate if you recognize the ego's goal, which is so clearly senseless that any effort on its behalf is necessarily expended on nothing. The ego's goal is quite explicitly ego autonomy. From the beginning, then, its purpose is to separate, sufficient unto itself and independent of any power except its own. This is why it is the symbol of separation. Every idea has a purpose, and its purpose is always the natural outcome of what it is. Everything that stems from the ego is the natural outcome of its central belief, and the way to undo its results is merely to recognize that their source is not natural, being out of accord with your true nature. I said before that to will contrary to God is wishful thinking and not real willing. His will is one because the extension of his will cannot be unlike itself. The real conflict you experience, then, is between the ego's idle wishes and the will of God which you share. Can this be a real conflict? Yours is the independence of creation, not of autonomy. Your whole creative function lies in your complete dependence on God, whose function he shares with you. By his willingness to share it, he became as dependent on you as you are on him. Do not ascribe the ego's arrogance to him who wills not to be independent of you. He has included you in his autonomy. Can you believe that autonomy is meaningless apart from him? The belief in ego autonomy is costing you the knowledge of your dependence on God, in which your freedom lies. The ego sees all dependency as threatening, and has twisted even your longing for God into a means of establishing itself. But do not be deceived by its interpretation of your conflict. The ego always attacks on behalf of separation. Believing it has nothing else. The ego is totally confused about reality, but it does not lose sight of its goal. It is much more vigilant than you are, because it is perfectly certain of its purpose, which it's not. You are confused because you do not recognize yours. True. You must recognize that the last thing the ego wishes you to realize is that you are afraid of it. For if the ego could give rise to fear, it would diminish your independence and weaken your power. Yet its one claim to your allegiance is that it can give power to you. Without this belief, you would not listen to it at all. How then can its existence continue if you realize that by accepting it, you are belittling yourself and depriving yourself of power? How then could you? The ego can and does allow you to regard yourself as supercilious, unbelieving, light-hearted, distant, emotionally shallow, callous, uninvolved, and even desperate, but not really afraid. Minimizing fear, but not its undoing, is the ego's constant effort, and is indeed a skill at which it is very ingenious. How can it preach separation without upholding it through fear? And would you listen to it if you recognize this is what it is doing? Your recognition of whatever seems to separate you from God is only fear. Regardless of its form, it takes quite apart from how the ego wants you to experience it. It is, therefore, the basic ego threat. Its dream of autonomy is shaken to its foundation by this awareness. For though you may countenance a false idea of independence, you will not accept the cost of fear if you recognize it. Yet this is the cost, and the ego cannot minimize it. If you overlook love, you are overlooking yourself, and you must fear unreality because you have denied yourself. By believing that you have successfully attacked truth, you are believing that attack has power. Very simply, then, you have become afraid of yourself. and no one wants to find what he believes would destroy him. If the ego's goal of autonomy could be accomplished, God's purpose could be defeated, and this is impossible. Only by learning what fear is can you finally learn to distinguish the possible from the impossible and the false from the true. According to the ego's teaching, its goal can be accomplished and God's purpose cannot. According to the Holy Spirit's teaching, only God's purpose can be accomplished, and it is accomplished already. God is as dependent on you as you are on him, because his autonomy encompasses yours and is therefore incomplete without it. You can only establish your autonomy by identifying with him and fulfilling your function as it exists in truth. The ego believes that to accomplish its goal is happiness, but it is given you to know that God's function is yours, and happiness cannot be found apart from your joint function. Your joint will. But like, the ego's purpose for happiness, I mean, you want to be happy too, regardless, but God's plan also includes the happiness, so you don't need the ego. Recognize only that the ego's goal, which you have pursued so diligently, has merely brought fear, and it becomes difficult to maintain that fear is happiness. Upheld by fear, that is what the ego would have you believe. Yet God's Son is not insane and cannot believe it. Let him but recognize it, and he will not accept it. For only the insane would choose fear in place of love, and only the insane could believe that love can be gained by attack. But the sane realize that only attack could produce fear, from which the love of God completely protects them. The ego analyzes. The Holy Spirit accepts. The appreciation of wholeness comes only through acceptance, for to analyze means to break down or to separate out. The attempt to understand totality by breaking it down is clearly the characteristically contradictory approach to the ego to everything. The ego believes that power, understanding, and truth lie in separation, and to establish this belief, it must attack. Unaware that the belief cannot be established and obsessed with the conviction that separation is salvation, the ego attacks everything it perceives by breaking it into small, disconnected parts without meaningful relationships, and therefore without meaning, because you can't recognize it. So as a kid, right, I took things apart. So we're saying, in very, 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 very broad terms, that like science is an ego's endeavor to explain, whereas religion is more of God's. Who knows? God knows. We know by proxy, but the ego will always substitute chaos for meaning. For if separation is salvation, harmony is a threat to the ego. The ego's interpretation of the laws of perception are, and would have to be, the exact opposite of the Holy Spirit's. The ego focuses on error and overlooks truth. It makes real every mistake it perceives, and with characteristically circular reasoning, concludes that because of the mistake, consistent truth must be meaningless. Because of the mistake, consistent truth must be meaningless. But the next step, then, is obvious. If consistent truth is meaningless, inconsistency must be true. Holding error clearly in mind and protecting what it was made real, the ego proceeds to the next step of its thought system. Error is real, and truth is error. The ego makes no attempt to understand this, and it is clearly not understandable. But the ego does make every attempt to demonstrate it, and this it does constantly. Analyzing to attack, meaning the ego succeeds in overlooking it, and is left with a series of fragmented perceptions, which it unifies on behalf of itself. This then becomes the universe it perceives, and it is the universe which in turn becomes its demonstration of its own reality. Do not underestimate the appeal of the ego's demonstrations to those who would listen. Selective perception chooses its witnesses carefully, and its witnesses are consistent. The case for insanity is strong to the insane. For reasoning ends at its beginning, and no thought system transcends its source. Yet reasoning without meaning cannot demonstrate anything, and those who are convinced by it must be deluded. Can the ego teach truly when it overlooks truth? Can it perceive what it has denied? The ego looks straight at the Father and does not see him, for it has denied his Son. Would you remember the Father? Accept his Son, and you will remember him. Nothing can demonstrate that his Son is unworthy, for nothing can prove that a lie is true. What you see of his Son through the eyes of the ego is a demonstration that his Son does not exist. Yet where the Son is, the Father must be. Accept what God does not deny, and it will demonstrate its truth. The witnesses of God stand in his light, and behold what he created. Their silence is the sign that they have beheld God's Son, and in the presence of Christ they need demonstrate nothing. For Christ speaks to them of himself and their Father. They are silent because Christ speaks to them, and it is his words they speak. Every brother you meet becomes a witness for Christ or for the ego. Depending on what you perceive in him, everyone convinces you of what you want to perceive, and of the reality of the kingdom you have chosen for your vigilance. Everything you perceive is a witness to the thought system you want to be true. Every brother has the power to release you. If you chose to be free, you cannot accept false witnesses of him unless you have evoked false witnesses against him. If he speaks not of Christ to you, you spoke not of Christ to him. You hear but your own voice, and if Christ speaks through you, you will hear him. Yeah, I mean, look, it said it, right? The insane makes sense to the insane, but it makes sense to nobody else. So when you're in the clutches of the devil, to use for literary purposes, you're not gonna recognize necessarily until you have a moment where you can kind of look past and see back to what is true and what makes sense. And I think it takes very traumatic moments for a lot of people, but I don't know. Look within. Nobody's wrong. We're all in the same situation. I don't know. Should be kind to each other. And in 500 years, we will have overthrown the cabal and we'll live in a peaceful society. So, a good day. I bid you adieu.